Our top story at this hour, days after President Biden spoke to his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin over the escalating conflict in Ukraine, there seems to be no change to the status quo. Instead, the crisis seems to have only escalated. While on one hand, President Biden is pushing for diplomacy, Russia has upped its hostile rhetoric against Kiev. In the latest, President Biden spoke with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy for an hour and a half and reaffirmed his commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Biden also promised U.S. help in case Moscow attacked Ukraine during his call with the Ukrainian president. Biden also held a separate call with leaders of NATO members of Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania and Slovakia, all of whom are located in Eastern Europe and deeply concerned by Russian military threat. The White House said that Biden, in his calls, pushed for diplomacy, including stalled peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. But Russia, meanwhile, has stepped up its hostile rhetoric against Kiev. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday said that the conflict in eastern Ukraine between Kiev's army and pro-Russian separatists looked like genocide.
Должен сказать и о русофобии как первому шагу к геноциду. То, что сейчас происходит на Донбассе, мы с вами хорошо видим, знаем. И это, конечно, очень напоминает этот геноцид, о котором вы сказали.
Russia also accused Ukraine of moving heavy artillery towards the front line of fighting with pro-Russian separatists and failing to engage in the peace process. Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson said that negotiations on a peaceful settlement have practically hit a dead end. Remember, Western and the Ukrainian leaders fear a Russian invasion. Their fear is valid since Russia seized Ukraine's Crimea region in 2014 and backs a separatist rebellion in the east. Russia has denied any such plans. It says that it has deployed its troops because it fears the Ukraine is becoming an outpost of the NATO alliance. Our correspondent Julia Chapman joins us now. Thanks for your time and welcome to this broadcast, Julia. There seems to be no end in sight despite deliberations between Biden, Putin and Zelenskyy. Julia, what is further stoking this border crisis?
Well, Russia certainly hasn't removed any of the pressure that it seems to be putting on the US, on other NATO countries with regards to its position over Ukraine. We've been hearing these comments from the Russian Foreign Ministry that NATO is pumping Kiev full of weapons, which NATO, of course, would deny, as would Kiev. But it really does reflect the concerns that Russia has of Ukraine moving ever closer to NATO and getting ever more support from NATO members, including in particular the US. Of course, Joe Biden, the US president, held a phone call with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president, yesterday after his talks with President Vladimir Putin earlier in the week. But he does say that he is pushing for diplomacy in this regard with Russia in order to try to de-escalate the situation, which it did seem to have helped after the talks on Tuesday. But certainly no end to the rhetoric, with Russia still accusing Ukraine of building up on the contact line in eastern Ukraine, which the government in Kiev hasn't commented on. But the US administration is still pushing for dialogue and says it's going to announce some sort of discussions between Russia and NATO partners to make Russia's concerns known.
Right, Julia, President Biden did confront Putin over the tensions between Ukraine and Russia. He even warned of sanctions if the crisis escalates. What are the ramifications of this tension to the European Union bloc?
Well, the European Union, of course, is very concerned of any kind of conflict that could break out on its borders. And indeed, the NATO members of the EU that are on the eastern flank of that military bloc could certainly see more military buildup themselves from NATO if there is deemed to be any kind of further risk from Russian aggression as NATO sees it. Now, Russia denies any such intention. It says it isn't planning to invade Ukraine and it's simply moving its own troops as it sees fit within its own borders. Of course, that comes with some sort of a discrepancy in opinions because many of these countries don't recognize Crimea as being Russian territory. But more dialogue is certainly on the table and will be needed to further de-escalate the situation. There so far has been no evidence that there has been troop withdrawal from the Russian side on the Ukrainian border since those talks with Joe Biden earlier in the week.
Finally, some of the countries in Eastern Europe are also concerned about Russia's threat. If at all Russia invades Ukraine, what kind of damage would that cause to these countries?
Well, that would depend on whether the violence were to spill out. It's a very hypothetical question. And as I say, Russia insists that it has no such plans to invade Ukraine. But certainly there would be a lot more NATO support if the violence were to get closer to the Eastern European borders. And of course, this would be of much concern to many of these countries, the situation in Ukraine. But bear in mind, there has been a conflict already in Ukraine since 2014 with Russian-backed separatists fighting the Ukrainian government that has resulted in the deaths of some 14,000 people, according to the government in Kiev. So it's not as though there isn't already violence in Europe. But of course, there are fears that that could escalate, that things could get even worse. And that is of great concern to many of these Eastern European countries.
Julia Chapman, thank you very much for your insights and for talking to us today. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.